joy and happiness that is here, and one of the subjects we'll be dealing with the healing power of joy. I also welcome so many of the young people. I feel very close to young people. We have a boy as a senior in college and one who graduated from college, 21 and 23 years of age, and I stroke their beards and comb their long hair and their mustache. But I don't see any, yes, there's a beard and a good, and the long hair. I think the young people today are great. And they are challenging us to re-examine some of our standards, and we are learning from them. And there's no break in the line of communication in our family. We argue and talk about everything at the breakfast table, and I think they're tremendous. Regarding the flying in, I don't know what the good Lord is trying to do, put wings on us, or maybe he felt that we weren't too angelic. But here we are, and we're happy to be here. It reminds me of the situation, and you probably heard Dr. Glenn Clark tell this when he was in Paris one day at a cafe, a sidewalk cafe, and he saw a Frenchman looking at a French and American lexicon dictionary. And he seemed a very friendly fellow, and he looked at this dictionary, the American-French dictionary, and then he got up and he extended his hand to Dr. Glenn Clark, and he said, "I'm enthused to make your connections." And so this morning, I'm certainly enthused to make your connections. He also told of influence. They said they're waiting for us to arrive, and that seemed very nice to Hal May and to me, which reminded me of the two teachers who were talking about prenatal influence, and that it could influence you in a deep and remarkable way. And one of the teachers said, I don't believe in prenatal influence at all, that what your mother thinks about before you're born, it affects your life. He said, why, when my mother was carrying me, she dropped a record and it didn't affect me. So when Gordon Kennison asked me to be one of the leaders at Winnipeg here, it scared me stiff, quite frankly. But in my weak moment, I said yes, which reminds me that people are like tea bags. They don't know their own strength until they get into hot water. And now I frankly am in hot water. It recalls to my mind that the judge who was asked to speak to to the men in the state penitentiary, and all the inmates were herded into the auditorium, not by choice, but, they were herded into the auditorium. And so this judge, this was a new experience for him, and he got up to speak, and he said, fellow citizens. And then he said, no, that's not right, because they were defranchised of their citizenship while they were incarcerated. And then he said, well, fellow prisoners. No, that wasn't right, because he wasn't one of them. He wasn't a prisoner. And finally, thoroughly confused, he said, I'm glad to see so many of you here. Poor fellow had his troubles. And let me say that it's good to have so many here as we explore inner principles of kingdom living and find a way for creative living that can transform our lives and the lives of others. And so with this in mind, let me present to you 3 creative principles for living. Know thyself, control thyself, and give thyself. One day in the city of Dresden, that misanthropic, pessimistic philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer, was examining a flower in the municipal greenhouse. And he was mumbling incoherently to himself, as was his habit, and he was quite an oddball character, and he roused the suspicions of the attendant. And so the attendant came up to Arthur Schopenhauer and said, "Sir, who are you?" Well, Schopenhauer raised his shaggy eyebrows and had a sort of enigmatic smile on his face, and he said to this attendant, "Sir, if you could tell me who I am, I would be greatly indebted to you." Well, Schopenhauer raised a question that has baffled the minds of men since the beginning of time. Well, who are we? Really now? Who are you? Who am I? Well, Socrates, one of the wisest of the Greeks, said, to know thyself is the beginning of wisdom. And when we know ourselves, what do we become acquainted with in ourselves? What do we find? I think the most apparent thing and most obvious thing are our bodies. And we are quite obvious of that in our rhythm that we had just a few moments ago. I'll never forget a doctor in Dayton, Ohio named John Wonder. I call him my Wonder Doctor. He was in internal medicine. He said, Kermit, when I work with the human body, I do so with awe, for I realize I'm in the presence of a miracle. And this MD saw that as he worked with the human body. He saw the creator behind it all. And Dr. Cressy Morrison, the man who wrote Man Does Not Stand Alone, says the digestive system, if we examine that, is a miracle. It's run like a well-run factory. When you eat food, a miracle takes place, whether you realize it or not. The food is broken down into its component parts and used by the various parts of the body, all unnoticed by you or by me unless we eat too much. And I do want to thank the Tims for a breakfast. It was a wonderful big breakfast, but I'm going to have the battle of the bulge if I keep that sort of thing up. But it was great. And as I speak to you, you'll hear that if you're still awake, two delicate shell-like structures on the side of your face picks up the vibrations of sound waves leaping across space and translates them to the brain in the form of words. Now, when you think of that, do you not realize, you and I, that we are in the presence of a miracle? The tongue is a marvelous instrument, but it has to be used with care. It's better to keep silent and have people think you are a fool than to speak up and remove all doubt. It sure is. Some persons are like the girl a fellow had on a date. He said she was like a car. She slipped her mind into neutral and let her tongue idle on. She goes through life with a horn stuck. She even has a nagging cough. Well, nothing is more frequently opened by mistake than the mouth. And I am speaking as a minister now, as a preacher. And the tongue can hurt. It was said of a certain woman that she had a tongue that was so sharp it would clip a hedge. And of a certain man that he was like a woodpecker. He earned his living by knocking. He always was in the negative. And naturally, he was unhappy and miserable most of his life. I think the tongue has probably undermined more characters and destroyed more churches and PTAs and other groups and brought more misery than we can possibly realize. Silence is golden, especially if we have nothing to say, or to say unkind things, or to pass on rumors without checking on the truth. So whenever I am tempted, and we're all tempted to make a derogatory remark about another person sometime or other, I am reminded of a verse that comes to my mind. There's so much good in the worst of us and so much bad in the best of us that it hardly behooves any of us to talk about the rest of us. The tongue then should be used as a marvelous instrument to build and to encourage and help others along life's way. And this brings us to the hand. Have you ever really examined your hand? It is a marvelous, unique instrument made up of flesh and bone and blood and marrow and veins and arteries, nails and muscle. It's an instrument that can bless or kill. The hand. It can caress or strangle. It can love or hate. Now we ask a very significant question this morning. What are our bodies for? At this point, we are reminded of the greatest life ever lived. Jesus had a body. He had hands that blessed and brake the bread, hands that healed, hands that blessed the lives of little children. He had ears that heard the anguish cries of sick humanity and heard the infinite longings of the human spirit. He had a voice that told of God's love. He spoke superb parables and uttered the matchless words of the Sermon on the Mount. In short, Jesus had a body, and he used it for the glory of God. And so must you and me. But even more miraculous, quite frankly, than our bodies are our minds. Minds that probe and inquire into the mystery and the existence of the greatness of God and in this great universe of which we play a vital part. These minds determine our lives. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher and soldier in ancient Rome, said, our life is what our thoughts make it. He's right. What you think you are, what you think determines your life. I'm reminded of Dr. Adler in Vienna, who during the First World War had two patients who had to have the right arms amputated at the shoulder. 2 years later, Both of these men happened to come to Dr. Adler's office the same week. And so Dr. Adler turned to the first man, and he said, "How are you getting along?" And he said, "Great. I'm married, I have a good job, and a wonderful little son." 3 days later, the other man came to see Dr. Adler, and he said, "Well, how are you doing now?" And he said, "Not at all. I can't do anything. I'm helpless. I cannot get a job. Marriage is out of the question for me." And there you have it. The same circumstances, but two totally different men, which tells you and me it's not the circumstances that make or break us, as our interpretation of those circumstances. Or as Montaigne said, a man is hurt not so much by what happens to him as by his opinion of what happens to him. Attitudes in life make all the difference in the world. I'm thinking now of a man who was 82 years of age and married a woman 27. And the doctor said to him, "Well, now, you know, the disparity in your age might be fatal." And the man thought a moment and said, "Well, if she dies, she dies." Now, there is an incorrigible optimist. It reminds me of a definition of a pessimist and an optimist. The pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, and the optimist, as you know, sees the opportunity in every difficulty. And you probably heard this, the optimist wakes up in the morning and says, "Good morning, God," and the pessimist says, "Good God, morning." But there is a profound difference in our attitude in life. And Dr. Beard, Rebecca Beard, I don't know whether you read some of her books or have met her personally, but she said more people are sick because they're unhappy than unhappy because they are sick. This is an MD speaking. And the worrier dies sooner than the non-worrier. The answer then is a deep and abiding faith, a positive attitude toward life. It's living in the power of positive prayer. And this is what we're actually trying to practice here at the Camp Farthest Out. It's linking our finite minds with the infinite mind, the mighty intelligence of God behind the universe, and knowing that God created you to be a joyous, wholesome, creative person. And sometimes, because of this fact, I'm amazed at the number of religious people with long, lugubrious faces looking like accidents going somewhere to happen. I remember a minister saying, "Well, things are so terrible in the world and no one has the right to be happy." He's missed the boat completely. Completely. Some of the greatest Christians I've ever met have an inner radiance and the joy that was expressed here just a few moments ago. A joy heals. You can take the quiet joy into a sick room, and speaking and visiting with people in the hospital reminds me that some persons are more liabilities than assets when they visit some people in the hospital. I know one woman said to the patient, "You know, my Aunt Susie had your ailment and she died, poor soul." Well, that's a great uplift. That's a great help. And when I had my coming out party with the gallbladder, this man came to visit a friend of mine. I called him my cellmate. He was my roommate next to me. And asking how he got along, and this fellow said, "Well, you know, sometimes they don't get all the stones and they leave one behind and you have to go through surgery again." The fellow was just, imagine a man saying that. I couldn't believe my ears. And he folded up like an accordion. And I said, "Now listen, he's not a physician, he's not a doctor, don't pay any attention to him. You had a very fine surgeon," because he was my surgeon too. And I know we'll both make it and with flying colors. But a quiet inner joy is a great thing, and it's an inner spiritual quality. "My joy I give unto you," said Jesus. People love to be with Jesus, who incidentally had a marvelous sense of humor, and we'll think about that later in a subject, humor is holy. But so often we miss the humor of Jesus with our Occidental literal interpretations of the Scripture when we are confronted with Oriental imagery. In knowing our bodies and minds, we live the second creative principle now, which is control thyself. I recall two men met on a narrow plank over across a muddy stretch on a path there. One was a great big blustery type of fellow. Another was of diminutive stature. And as they came to the center, it was obvious that one of them would have to give way. Well, this big blustery fellow came up, and as he met this little fellow, he said, "I never give way for a fool." Well, the little fellow thought a moment, he stepped aside and said, "I always do." Now, which man had controlled the situation? In business, the man who loses his head loses the deal. And so with young people on the threshold of life, discipline is essential to character. We live in a universe and a world that demands discipline in no uncertain terms. I put my finger in a fire and I get burned. And I learned, I don't do that. Life disciplines me. So with health principles and other principles. So with spiritual discipline. Robert Louis Stevenson, his first part of his life was wasted in uncontrolled living. And then he wrote, "I came about like a well-handled ship. Only when he got control of himself was he able to channel his ability into constructive literary power. And no man achieves anything in this world, whether it's music or arts or literature or whatever, or athletic or whatever it is, without discipline, hard discipline." I know we had a great athlete come to Beloit, Bob Richards, and he spoke about this discipline, so absolutely essential to develop the body to its utmost capacity to achieve. And so it is. I know one time, it was back in Ohio State University, they're talking about this progressive education. Now, you never want to discipline a child. I don't understand why they did that, because life is discipline. But you might cause a traumatic experience that affect them later in life and that sort of thing. And so they're able to do as they please. What would you want to do? Well, I shook them up one time, the experts, and one little girl said one morning, "Do I have to do what I want to do this morning?" And there we have it. I think children and young people expect discipline, expect guidelines, and we do not help them at all if we neglect this aspect of a vital part, an area of their life. It's so with character. It's nonsense to say that character comes in our sleep. No, character is hammered out on the anvil of self-discipline. And lack of discipline is many reasons for divorces in marriage. When couples come to consult, and we always have a long time of interviews and consultations with couples before they're married, and I always tell them that any fool can get married. It takes character to stay married. Character. And that's the crux of it. I remember some years ago talking to Dr. Faust, who was the head of the Bureau of Reconciliation in Columbus, on marital problems that people came from all over the city to see him. And he said this: "It's not sex or money, but lack of character. When one or both thinks that he or she is the center of the universe." Now, this begins in the cradle. A basic philosophy of life is determined if the child says, "If I yell long enough and hard enough, I'll get what I want." And unless this is curbed and they go into tantrums and something is done about it, you have a problem child. This carries into adult life. One of the professors, and this is a professor at Ohio State University, the wife came to see Dr. Faust, and she said, "I'm married to an intellectual genius, but an emotional moron." And he said, "What do you mean?" "Well, when he doesn't get his way," this Ohio State professor, "when he doesn't get his way, he stomps out of the room and threatens to kill himself." Well, she said, "One day I got fed up with it, and I said, 'All right, go kill yourself.'" And he stomped up to the bathroom and slammed the door, and she heard a tinkering and a moaning, and she saw a red fluid, and she got excited, and he had poured mercurochrome. A university professor, a PhD in mercurochrome. Intellectual genius, but an emotional moron. And he was telling about another, a wife, whenever she wanted anything, or a fur coat, she'd feign a heart attack or something, and his husband would get it for her. And he said, "You know, we men know this as domestic racketeering." Well, some good can come out of marital arguments. You know how Beethoven, I might spoil this for you, but you know how Beethoven wrote his Fifth Symphony? He got an argument with his wife, and she said, "Ya, ya, ya, ya." Isn't that awful? Every time I hear that now, I think, I'm sorry. And sometimes husbands pout and they give the silent treatment. They're childish. Really, they ought to be spanked, or should have been spanked long ago. And problems in so many organizations, in churches, in Rotary, in school boards, and college campuses, are adults physically, but emotionally, they're childish. And we used to have to admit that there needs a great deal of self-control. Now, I know this is difficult because you do meet some people who are difficult. With a little more effort, they could be impossible. And you have to deal with them, and you have to learn self-control. And you can't use $1's worth of emotion over a nickel incident. Dr. Sadler, the great psychiatrist in Chicago, the late Dr. Sadler said, keep your emotions on an even keel and you'll have a healthier body. He's right. Learn to control these emotional leaks. The greatest lives then are disciplined lives. They have learned the second great principle, control thyself. Now this leads us to the last great principle, which is to give thyself in loving service to others. This makes a great church. It makes a great family. It makes a great individual. This was Jesus' answer to life. Whosoever will find his life in all its beauty and grandeur and power will lose it. If you want to find life in its radiance and majesty, forget yourself and give yourself to something beyond yourself, to God and his kingdom, and you'll find an inner power and a beauty and a majesty in life you never experienced before. This giving of the self begins in the home. And I think here is where most of us fail, and I'm always speaking to myself, as you know. Why is it that we are most inconsiderate of those we love the most? I don't know. So she says to him, the next time we get ready to go someplace, you dress the children, and I'll sit outside the car and honk the horn. Well, this goes on. We also need to express intelligent love to our children and young people so that mother's love does not become smother's love. And I often remember Dr. Glenn Clark speaking about this, where a mother's love would be so possessive that when the son goes out with a girl on a date, she does everything to discourage it and turn against the girl and everything because she wants the son for herself. It's not an outgiving, divine, wonderful love. It's a smother's love, a possessive love. And it will destroy both of them if they allow it to continue to go on. We need a selfless love between young parents and young people. I'm thinking now of a football story that I read some years ago that I'll always remember the rest of my life. Bill Stern, the sports commentator, told this story about Lou Little, who many years ago was coach at Columbia University. At the time of this incident, he was a coach at Georgetown University, and he said he had a boy on his squad who was not too good as a football player, but he was a morale builder. He sparked a team to victory. It was just good to have him around. And Lou especially liked the way that this young lad walked with his father on the university campus, arm in arm, very close together, whenever his father came to visit the university. But one day, about a week before the final game with Fordham University, the boy's mother called Lou Little on the phone long distance. And she said, my husband died suddenly this morning. Will you break the news to my boy? He'll take it better if it comes from you. He admires you so much. Well, Lou Little said it was the most difficult thing he had to do. But he called this young lad into his office and told him. He took it manfully and went home for the funeral service. A few days later, he came back and he approached Lou Little and he said, I want to ask you something that means very much to me. I want to start in that game against Fordham. I think it's what my father would have liked most. Well, Lou hesitated. This wasn't like the boy, but this was an unusual circumstance. And so he said, all right, you can start that game, but you know you're not good enough to stay in there for very long. But you know, Lou Little never took that lad out of that game. He sparked the team to victory. He was the reason why that team won the game that day. And after the game was over and they're walking back to the clubhouse, Lou Little threw his arm around the young lad's shoulder and he said, "Boy, you were terrific today. You never played that kind of football before. What got into you?" And the young man said, "Well, Lou, you remember how my father and I, whenever he came to visit the university campus, we would walk arm in arm together? Well, few people knew that my father was totally blind. And this afternoon was the first time he ever saw me play." Think of the love between that father and that son. This principle of giving yourself is the law of life. It's so true that one may well question whether much that we consider sacrifice is not a misnomer. When we give ourselves to someone we love, or for a great cause, the gain for ourselves in strength and enrichment of character and joy more than compensates for any sacrifice on our part. David Livingstone left the security of a Scottish home for the dangers of the wilds of Africa at that time, to minister to the African people the Spirit of Christ, only with the love of Christ in his heart, and he transformed the lives of thousands. When Livingstone came to the end of his life, they found him one day with his head resting on an open Bible. He had quietly gone on to God. Well, some years before, someone spoke to him of his great sacrifice. And David Livingstone said, "Sacrifice? Well, I've never sacrificed a day in my life." I know what he meant. When you lose yourself in loving service to mankind in the spirit of the living Christ, you don't sense any sacrifice. It's the joy of union with Christ in the ongoing movement of building his kingdom here on earth. The joy that comes is tremendous. We need this spirit in all fields of endeavor, but especially in the realm of inner space. That is, we must conquer inner space as well as outer space. For even though we do and have reached the moon and later Mars, we still have the problems of Earth unless we conquer inner space. And this is what we're endeavoring to do at CFO. In fact, one of Shakespeare's characters, long before our space age, expressed it this way: "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." We have the same problems today, only magnified by portending events. Evidently, it's easier to land on the moon and Mars or colonize Venus than it is to Christianize the earth. And yet what happens in inner space will determine our destiny in outer space. The need today is not just for pioneers in medicine and education and science, but in the realm of the Spirit, to conquer inner space, that our thoughts and our motivations may be Christ-like, and that we may be champions of truth and beauty and justice and love and faith. And this is what we're endeavoring to do here. I close then with this. Some years ago, anthropologists discovered the remains of a prehistoric man in ancient Palestine. Because of the location in which this discovery was made, they referred to this creature as the Galilean man. Standing on the hilltop, one can look across the countryside to another hill and there envision a man upon the cross. Don't we realize that all the progress of mankind is from the Galilean man to the man of Galilee? From brute force to spiritual love. From centering on self to centering on others. It's losing one's life for Christ and mankind. And then we shall not become the casualties, but the victors of our space age. This is the hope of humanity, and this is the challenge of the hour. The whole purpose of life is to dedicate our bodies, minds, and spirits to the Most High for the cause of humanity and for the glory of God.